Oh my goodness, Brandon, why do I have three TVs in my living room again, all set up? What's going on?
QLED versus OLED video. We got a
Okay.
QLED, an OLED, and then a really big QLED here. We're going to be showing the people why they would buy an OLED versus a QLED. So we got a really nice one here. This is a nice OLED obviously here, and then we have the 98-inch TCL here. So all these TVs are relatively similar in price, so why would you buy one of these? We're gonna get into that at the end, but first we have to differentiate the TVs.
Yeah, so tell me, I know we've talked about it before, but whew, what's the difference between a QLED and OLED? Why do I care?
Okay, let's get into that. First, we have to define what a QLED and an OLED are. I'm gonna do this really quickly because I know it's a little technical, but basically a QLED or LED TV has light in the back that shines through all the time, and then you're trying to stop some of that light with dimming zones, and you're changing that light into colors with color filters. That is the Q layer or the quantum layer. And showing some of the tests at the end will help explain how that works a little bit better. But let's talk about the OLED. Now, OLED is organic light emitting diode, and it's a newer technology for TVs in general. And an OLED consists of millions of pixels that can all be lit up or change to a certain color or be completely off, allowing for it to have perfect contrast where you can have pixels that are on and off right next to each other, creating perfect contrast. Now, because the OLED has that pixel level control, their panels are typically thinner, at least at the top of the screens. However, they sort of have that lower backside area that sticks out a little bit. And you know, we can all have respect for that. But if you're gonna put one of these OLED TVs on the wall, it's not just that thin piece at the top is what you're gonna see. You will still see the entire thickness of the TV. So it's kind of a trade-off. It looks cool on a stand. Sometimes hanging it, you kind of defeat the purpose of having that thin screen because it has that area. And a couple of the newer OLED TVs like the LG G3, you know, that looks really cool when it's on the wall because it is about 3/4 of an inch thick. So awesome looking TV. On the other hand, QLED TVs are generally thicker overall because they have that backlight system that needs depth to shine through the screen. Mini LED QLEDs are even thinner because they have smaller lights in the back, but they still have that minimum 3/4 inch depth. However, the entire TV can be that depth now. So if you look at one of these really nice QLEDs like the Samsung QN95C here, you could hang this on the wall and it's very flat, actually flatter than most OLED TVs would look on the wall, except for maybe that G3 I was talking about. So besides how the panels are built, these TVs also look a little differently because of where speaker placements are and HDMI ports are on the TVs themselves. So talking about speakers, QLED TVs typically have speakers on the bottom and on the sides. And a little bit more depth allows you to have smaller speakers around the edges. Now, OLED TVs sometimes also have speakers on the bottom. They are thicker at the bottom as we talked about, but a lot of the new OLED TVs also have speakers that vibrate the panel and come out from the screen, which is a really cool option. And I just don't think that's something you're going to be able to get on a QLED type TV. And then with regards to the connectivity, I mean, a QLED or an OLED TV can have all kinds of great features. They normally both have the eARC port that you can send sound out to your sound bar. Depending on if you have a soundbar that's made by the same company as your TV, they can work with the TV and give you operating system information on the screen. And then gaming features also are something that both kinds of TVs have. You can have 4K at 120, you can have 144 hertz panels, you can have VRR and all the other things like the game bar and stuff. So I don't think there's necessarily an advantage when it comes to connectivity for one kind of technology versus the other. The same thing goes for operating systems too. I mean, Samsung has both OLEDs and QLEDs now. So you get that Tizen operating system, the same on an OLED and a QLED. Same thing for LG. They sell LED type TVs and they sell OLEDs. So that WebOS is available on both. And the same for Sony. They have the Google operating system on both LED and their OLED lineup. So now I want to get into a couple of things that differentiate these two TVs from the visual perspective. And the first thing that you should notice is that typically QLED TVs can get a lot brighter, at least in full screen. So you can see here when we're watching sports that if you're sitting in front of the smaller QLED on the left there, it's far brighter than the OLED. Now, that is about the brightest QLED we've ever seen, the QN95C from Samsung. And this LG C3 on the right is not the brightest OLED ever. And I'll get into that in a bit, how the OLED TVs are getting even brighter. But you can just see in a general matchup right here, there will be a brightness advantage to having that QLED TV. However, that doesn't mean that that brightness difference will always be there. And when you're watching something that's similar brightness, if it's not a full white screen, then you'll notice that the OLED has much better contrast. So you'll see perfect blacks and things will look not quite as black on a QLED TV. So anyone that sort of knows this will say that the OLED has the advantage with the black level and it's typically bright enough, but a QLED will be extremely bright and maybe suffers a little bit from having raised black levels, or you'll just see some blooming, which we'll talk about in a second. And of course, that's a really good QLED as I talked about. Now, to the right, we have the 98-inch TCL that I have, the R754, which I'm a big fan of, and I'm gonna talk in the buying advice about why I might think you'd get that, but it does not have the same black levels of either of these TVs on the left. And you can see off angle, it's harder to see the colors in general. Same goes for that QN95C when you get at an angle. Typically, the OLED TVs will look better, and specifically the QD OLEDs look even better from an angle. But this TCL is not the mini LED version. They are coming out with that later on this year. I'm very excited for that. And I think at 100-inch with mini LED, that could be a big seller because the corresponding OLED TV is $25,000 in that size. So huge price difference. Again, talk more about that in a second. And when watching these kind of sports and news and cable stuff that's upscaled from whatever 1080 or 720 all the way up to 4K here, I typically feel like OLED TVs are a little bit more crisp or they upscale better, whereas QLED TVs sometimes to me they look a little softer. So if you're watching the lower bandwidth content, I typically think that the OLEDs look better. However, the motion of the TVs is a little different. Just the way that QLED TVs work, they have a little natural motion interpolation where you just see things a little bit more smoothly, where OLED, that response rate on an OLED is so fast that sometimes shows or even movies have a little bit more of a herky-jerky feeling to them, and sometimes I need to add a little bit of motion interpolation. That's sort of something that every individual can look at for themselves, and that can come into play when gaming because a lot of gamers will like a very responsive TV so that you can move and whatever you're seeing in your game is exactly what you're seeing on screen. And it's really tough for a QLED to be as responsive as an OLED TV that has like an instant response rate. Now, again, both of them have the same refresh rate, 4K at 120, and typically gaming looks awesome on both of them, but a QLED will have a little bit more ghosting normally, but that's gaming. Most people that watch these TVs are probably watching news and sports, and even if they're watching movies on these channels on cable, it's in SDR, which doesn't have the most dynamic range to the color and brightness and all that. But where these TVs really shine and you really can see some differences is with the HDR movies when you're watching them on DVD or if you're watching them off some of the streaming services that offer HDR. So the main principles of the two TVs sort of remain when watching HDR movies. The QLED will be brighter full screen and it can get really bright, whereas the OLED TV will have brighter highlights and you'll notice some spectacular highlights on the TV. But that doesn't mean the QLED doesn't have them as well. It's just that it has all the light in the back and you're trying to stop some of that in order to make this look good. And with brighter highlights and even darker areas on the screen because of that dynamic range, it's just very challenging on a QLED to compete with all the different things that HDR has to offer. Again, this QN95C from Samsung, a mini LED, probably one of the best I've ever seen, is doing a great job at comparing to this OLED TV. And again, this isn't the brightest OLED TV that there is. So if this was something like the LG G3 or one of the QD OLEDs like even the one from Samsung, the S95C, you might even see a bigger difference in just how bright the highlights are on the OLED, whereas the general picture can get brighter in a brighter scene on the QLED TV. So you may be unsure which is better. Do you want that really bright QLED? Maybe it doesn't have the perfect highlights or the perfect black levels, or do you want a less bright OLED that still has spectacular highlights? Well, that kind of comes down to what sort of room you're going to be in. And if you're talking about rooms, you're talking about what things you have in the rooms, like what kind of ambient light is coming in. So for example, we have this light set up now that would kind of represent a large window that's directly onto your screen. And obviously nobody really wants that, or you could probably shut that light off with some curtains. But if you have a situation like this, or if your room's just bright in general, you can see that the QLED handles that reflectivity a little bit better, both because of the anti-reflective coating on the screen, but because it's also brighter full screen. So if you're watching a lot of news or sports, things that are brighter typically, then you'll benefit from having that QLED. But this OLED TV isn't terrible at handling the reflection. It does knock it down quite well. It's just that the TV isn't as bright full screen, so then you also notice it a bit more. If you're in a theater room, then this probably doesn't matter. You aren't going to have lights that bother you, so then the brightness level is also not that important because you're your eyes in a dark room will adjust to the OLED TV, and then those highlights will look even more spectacular. But then that brings me to the next test, which is the ability to control the light, because there's a huge difference from that perspective. So this is a dimming test where you can see, these white circles moving against a black background. And that's going to look pretty much perfect on an OLED TV because every pixel is lit individually, but that's not the case with these QLED TVs. You're going to have, areas called dimming zones shutting down the light in some areas and letting it through in the others. And the quality of your QLED TV or your LED TV is somewhat based on how well it performs in this test. If you have a high-end Samsung or high-end Sony or even these other brands, TCL and Hisense, that are their top models, those mini LED TVs do a pretty good job with that, having a lot of dimming zones. The less expensive LED TVs don't do as well in this test, or sometimes they don't even have the dimming zones, so you'll just see more gray versus white instead of black versus white. And off angle, that blooming can get worse, so if you're sitting in a wide viewing area, you may notice it even more, and that just goes for the general picture quality as well. Sometimes it can be harder to see QLED TVs from an angle. The picture falls off a little bit more, and it doesn't do that quite as bad as an OLED TV. So that's just another test to differentiate between these two types of technology, knowing that you're never gonna have this sort of issue with an OLED TV, and you're gonna have infinite contrast, and that is something the QLED TVs or LED TVs are always trying to achieve, but can't quite perfect. And then last but not least, we have this dirty screen effect test that shows us the screen uniformity, which is something that varies from panel to panel. But in general, since I've been reviewing TVs, I have noticed that LED or QLED TVs, specifically the VA panels and ones that have the really good anti-reflective coating, don't have the best screen uniformity. So you'll notice little dark areas behind the hockey player. And this kind of stuff shows up when you're watching bright sports. If you're watching, hockey or soccer, or if you're gaming, you'll notice that cloudy area if your TV has it. OLED TVs aren't always perfect, but typically they're better. And in this case, you can tell that this LG C3 definitely looks better than the Samsung QN95C and even the TCL TV we have to a degree. So, OLEDs look a little better. The QD OLEDs are probably what look best with regards to this test. And then, the new IPS or ADS panels that are on some of these mid-level LED TVs, they do look a little bit better, but they're sacrificing other features in the middle range of LED TVs. Now, there is one issue with OLED panels, and that's like the elephant in the room, which is burn-in. Will an OLED TV get burn-in over time? Now, my philosophy has always been, I would rather take an awesome TV now that looks fantastic, and if 5 or 10 years down the road it had some burn-in, that would be better for a 5-year situation than buying a lesser TV now that I just don't like the look of, because I think that one will be safe. And I had a friend where we went to his house and he had what looked to be burn-in of a sort over his LG C7 TV. He had it over a fireplace, but he never used the fireplace, so we really don't know what that burn-in was specifically, but I replaced it. He was a little bit unhappy that in 4 or 5 years, his TV had that issue. But in general, I'm not really concerned about burn-in on these TVs. Like I said, I'd rather just have an awesome looking TV, but it is something to think about, and I know people will comment about this in the comments. So now we get to the most important part, which is buying advice. What actual TV should you buy? Now, a lot does depend on the size of your room, the conditions as we talked about. And if those conditions are that you have a really bright room, then maybe a QLED would just be better, like we talked about earlier. If the room is a dark room, or if you have a home theater, an OLED might be better in general because you don't have those lights to reflect, and you want to get the super bright highlights that an OLED provide. But if you ask me what I would buy, typically it's an OLED TV. One is because I review TVs, so the cost isn't as important. If I'm reviewing them, I get a little bit more benefit out of them. But if I'm gonna buy one TV, it's probably gonna be an OLED TV, and I would just shut the curtains if it's too bright, and I would probably pick one like the LG G3 that is extremely bright, so bright that it can compete with some of these mini LED TVs on the highest end being over 1500 nits, while at the same time being able to have spectacular highlights, awesome movie TV, awesome gaming TV, looks really cool and clean on the wall, and really there isn't much downside. So that's like the best TV I can think of that I've reviewed to date. I also think that the Sony A95L, when it comes out, will be another TV that I will really like. However, both of those TVs at their best are only 77 inches. If you go up to 83 inch, they don't have all of the same features, aren't quite as bright, and a lot of people ask me then, would I get an 83 inch OLED versus possibly a QLED that's 85 inches? And then it comes down to the price, because now you're talking about a TV of similar sizes, but a lot of these OLED TVs are twice the cost of something like the Samsung QN90B from last year. That's only $22.99 at the time of recording this video, whereas the LG C-Series OLED that we have here is up over $4,000 or $5,000 depending on which model you get. So I really like the C2 of last year because that TV is basically the same as this C3, while it's definitely less expensive, but still not nearly as inexpensive as this QLED, the top QLED in the Samsung QN90B from last year. I thought it was a great TV, and for most people, it's probably gonna still be better than they ever expected. And you know, you'd have to start getting into the lower price LEDs in order to kind of buy something that's in a budget that you can afford, because there's really no such thing as a cheap OLED. They all kind of start at a certain price point, and so a lot of people are just kind of priced out of it because they don't need all the features. They're really not watching these really crisp HDR movies that make a difference. So if you're just watching news and sports and all that, I think a regular LED TV from a reputable brand that you're comfortable with a lot of the features we talked about earlier, like the local dimming, gaming features, the operating system that you're comfortable with, or even if you have a third-party device, maybe you don't even need to worry about that sort of thing. So a lot of options down the list as you go down in price for QLEDs and LED TVs. Unfortunately, OLEDs just kind of start at a certain price point and then they go up from there. And then lastly, we go to like the mega size TVs, because a lot of people ask me, should I get that giant TCL that you have, or maybe even one of the ultra short throws where you can get even a bigger screen, or just go with an 83 inch OLED? And my take is that I really like this TCL R754. I think I'm gonna like the new QM8 98 inch TV even better. So if I had to pick a giant screen, I might go with that QLED TV, because they don't have anything larger in the OLEDs unless you're talking about the LG G2 from last year, and that's $25,000. So just completely out of budget for me. Whereas the TCL TVs, this one right here, is only $5,000 right now, where a lot of these other ones started at. That's how much the LG C3 in the middle costs, somewhere in the $5,600 range. And if you go 85 inch on this Samsung on the left, you're still talking about something around $5,000. So if you can get something that's minimally 15 inches bigger, then I would definitely go with this TCL here. Great opportunity. And if you're still waiting for the rest of the year here, you do have one from Sony, gonna be the X90L at 98 inch and TCL's QM8 at 98 inch as well. So there's two, somewhat affordable TVs. They're like $10,000 to start. Probably will go down in price a little bit, but those could be great options. Or you're talking about an 85 inch QLED, which I think would be great for most rooms. It's still huge. Most people don't need something that large. 83 inch OLEDs. And as you go down, the price differences become a big factor, but definitely think about all the other things that we talked about in this video, including the testing and what kind of content and all that you watch. And those are all the things you need to know about QLEDs versus OLEDs. Easy stuff, right, Jen?
Oh, right. I wasn't paying attention. But hopefully you were paying attention. And if not, or if you have any questions, go ahead and comment below and let us know what your questions are. But if you would like buying advice on which of these TVs is going to be best for you, take our quiz. The link is below at betheinstaller.com/quiz.
You can select from the different content you might watch, what room conditions you have, size of TVs, brands, all that. Check it out.
And if you want to see the unboxing of these two awesome TVs, you can check out the videos right here and here.
See you in the next one.
Bye.